So you've probably seen fashion designers or the designers on Project Runway that are taking a dress form and they're pinning fabric to it and they're pulling it this way and that way and they're pinning it and they're drawing lines and they've got their design tape on there, and then all of a sudden they've got this magnificent design and they turn it into a garment. So today I'm going to teach you all the basics you need to start doing that yourself. And the best way to start learning this is starting with the basic one dart bodice. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to drape out the front and the back bodice. And then I'm going to show you how I transfer my designs from fabric to paper so that way I have a working pattern. So today you're going to learn draping basics and how to transfer that design to paper. Make sure you follow to the end so you don't miss any of the tips and details I'm going to go over throughout this process. So let's start draping. Just real quick, if you guys haven't checked out the online sewing school that I started along with the sewing club and the Discord, make sure you check it out. There's going to be a link down below in the description. And if you haven't subscribed yet to Sewing Anastasia here on YouTube, well, make sure you do because it really helps out the sewing channel a lot. All right, now back to our video. The first thing we need to do is prep our fabric. I'm going to be using a plain woven pink cotton today. It's just like muslin. It just happens to be pink, so that way it's easier for you to see. Now we also need to figure out what size fabric to start with. So I think the easiest thing to do is go ahead and measure your dress form from the top of the neck to the waist and then add 5 inches. And then measure from center front to the side seam and add another 5 inches. And you're going to end up with a rectangle. And now we need to cut this rectangle out of our fabric. But be really careful you're following your grain lines. Let's go over it. So when you're measuring the width of your fabric, make sure you're coming out from your grain line because this grain line is going to be our center front when we're draping. So I have my mark here for my measurement. I'm going to snip into it and then I'm going to rip my fabric so that way it rips straight on the grain. And now I'm going to cut another piece the same size so I have one for the back of my bodice. So I have both of my pieces cut out, front and back. And if you need some extra details about grain lines, make sure you check out my other video on that. So sometimes when fabric is hanging out and rolled up and being shipped and all that good stuff, the fibers start to skew and move in different directions a little bit. So this technique called blocking is going to get the fibers back where they belong in their original state. So if you've ever ripped a piece of fabric and it starts to look a little crooked, that's because it is skewed, so you can fix that. So follow along to learn how to block your fabric. So what you're going to do is take your fabric and you're going to pull it on the bias, both directions. And this is helping the fabric get back to where it belongs. I also like to do it for the entire length of it. So you're just stretching it. You'll notice that fabric does stretch real nice on that 45. And now if we take it and we place it on this grid mat here, you can see that it's nice and straight on all the edges, which means we have it blocked. If yours is looking really crooked, you need to pull it in that opposite direction so that way you can get it in the perfect shape. The last part of prepping your fabric is ironing it nice and flat and ironing over the selvage 1 inch towards the inside. So I'm gonna go do that and then we're ready to start draping. To prep the dress form, you need to grab a piece of ribbon, twill tape, seam tape, something that's nice and sturdy, and we're going to pin it from apex to apex. Apex to apex is going to be right at the center of the bust where that princess line is. So we want to make a nice, strong line right there. So that way, when we're draping, our drape doesn't go in between the bust because we want this drape to come down from the bust. It's not going to be concave into the bust. Now you don't need to do this for all designs, but for the basic bodice, you do need to do this. Now we're gonna start putting our fabric on the dress form. I'm going to start by pinning my fabric at the top neck because we need extra fabric for the shoulder later on. So I'm going to pin right at the base of the neck. And now you're gonna notice when I'm pinning horizontally into the dress form. I'm not trying to pin directly into it because they won't go into it because it's hard underneath. And we're not pinning down or up from the bottom. We're pinning horizontally. I have about 2 inches here beyond the neckline. And then we're just going to lightly hold our fabric and line it up with the center front on the dress form. Now here's that spot right here where the twill tape is going to hold our fabric out, which we want. We do not want the fabric going in between the bust because our design is going to be cut on fold and it will not be going in the bust like that. So that looks good. Now we're gonna pin all the way to the waist. So one last pin at the twill tape at the waist. So your first step is always pinning down center front. Now that we have center front pinned, we're going to work around the neck and the shoulder. So you're gonna notice we have all these pole lines in here. So what we need to do is release the tension around the neck so that the fabric's going to drape around the neck and the shoulder. So when you cut into your fabric, you don't wanna cut beyond the stitching line that's here at the base of the neck. So go ahead, put some cuts into it and start releasing that fabric. I'm also going to cut a little closer to center front here. And once you get the fabric to release around the neck, you can remove that pin that's up a little higher. And now you're gonna notice that the fabric just blends right over to the shoulder and we have gotten rid of those pole lines that we had. And now we can go ahead and pin right at the shoulder. And when you feel the fabric and the dress form, you can feel that little ridge where the seam is in the shoulder. You can also cut off these extra little chunks that are up here. We don't need those on there. There we go. Now that we have the shoulder draped, it's time to move on to the armhole and the side seam. So we're in the armhole. You do want to leave a little bit of ease. You don't have to if you want something very fitted in the armhole, but the way you're going to leave some ease is by just making a little pinch of fabric, about 1/8 of an inch. So 1/4 inch total, but 1/8 of an inch. And then go ahead and pin that in place so it's not going to move on you. And now you can drape the fabric nicely to the side seam. Notice I'm not getting any pole lines in here, so we want this to be smooth. If you're pulling it too much, you're gonna see your fabric start to stretch and pull. You just want this to be a nice, smooth drape. And then go ahead, feel the side seam in the side of the dress form. You can kind of see when I push on it, that little ridge that pops out. That's the ridge you're looking for to put your pins into, again, horizontally. So we're gonna pin all the way to the waist. You can feel that twill tape in there. Put one last pin there in the middle of that twill tape. Now this extra fabric you have over here, you can go ahead and cut some of that off so it's not in your way. So I'm gonna cut off some of this extra fabric. You wanna leave some fabric here though, a few inches, because if we need to adjust the design, we need some extra fabric to work with. Okay, now that's a little easier to work with since we have less fabric there. Now what we need to do is create the dart and shape the waist. So let's talk about making this dart. So you'll notice when I hold this dart excess here, we start to get these pole lines on the side. So what we need to do is clip into it. So wherever you're going to have a seam and you start to get pole lines by it, you can clip into the fabric at that point to release it. Since we're just making a basic bodice, it's going to end at the waist. So that's why we're going to have a seam here at the waist. Eventually, maybe that would connect to a skirt, or maybe you're just making a bodice. And that's why we can clip in right to the waist, because there's going to be a seam there. So what I like to do is roughly grab the excess and pin it, just one pin at the waist so I can really see what's happening here with these pole lines. And now I'm going to clip up to the waist. So you're gonna notice when I start clipping up to the waist, it automatically releases the pole line and starts to open up around the hip there. You can see right here that excess that opened up, and automatically it looks so much smoother and that pole line went away. I'm gonna add one more cut in here and then we'll really work the dart. There we go, nice and smooth. Okay. Now let's take a look at the front. And just for good measure, I'm going to put a few cuts in the front up to the waist just to make sure everything is going to be nice and smooth. Here we go. A little release there actually at the front. Check that out. So now you can see we have this extra chunk of fabric here. Looks really weird, right? And we want this fabric to fit the body. So talking about a dart before, and we're gonna turn all this extra fabric into a dart so that way we can have a nice fitted, tailored, basic bodice. And that's what a dart does. It takes the extra fabric and it tailors up the garment. So a dart is an intake of fabric to create shape. And if we didn't have a dart here, it just wouldn't fit right. It wouldn't fit into the waist of anything unless you were gathering it or pleating it. But for this basic bodice, we want to create a dart. To create the dart, we're going to drape the fabric over to the princess line, which is this vertical line that's running through the dress form here. So you can feel it in there. So a lot of this has to do with feeling. So we can feel that fabric in there. And now what we're going to do is take all the excess fabric, push it over towards center front, and then we want the fold of the fabric on the other side to line up with that princess line. So you can start to feel that in there. And now we want that to line up. We're gonna put a pin in there. And then keep draping. This isn't a contour dart, so you don't want it to be skin tight on the body. You just want it to drape nicely against the shape of the body. And you can just roll the fabric with your fingers if you need to change the positioning. You can even put a few pins over here just while you're doing this to kind of keep the fabric taut. But remember, no pull lines. You don't want to pull it so tight that you're seeing pull lines in it. We can remove these other pins. Now you should have a nice, smooth front bodice pinned on your dress form. Now that we have our drape on the dress form just how we want it, it's time to trace it out on the dress form with a pencil. Do not use a permanent marker. You will destroy your dress form. Use a pencil. You can always erase it off. And what we're going to do is follow all the seam lines that are on the dress form: the neck, the shoulder, the armhole, the side seam, and the waist, plus the dart. And this is going to allow us to remove our design here from the dress form and transfer it to paper to make it into a pattern. So I'm going to start at the center front, and I'm going to make sure that my pencil is right in the groove at the neck. Also want to point out, I snipped into my neck a little too much, but it's not spreading open a ton, so it's going to be okay. But really try not to cut in beyond the neck there. And now we're going to go to the shoulder, and you're just going to feel that groove on the dress form and run your pencil along that shoulder seam. And now for the armhole, we're going to go right around the ridge of the armhole. Make this as smooth as you can. And now when we get to the side seam, we're going to follow that groove right along the side seam there. And we are going to straighten these lines out after with our rulers, but still try and make them as nice as you can. Now I'm going to go to the waist. I'm going to go to the top of the twill tape here. And now while I have the dart on the dress form, I'm going to mark both sides of it. So I'm going to mark the top fold, and then I'm going to mark the layer right next to it. And I'm going to do this all the way up to the tip of the dart. Okay, so now we have everything marked and we are ready to take this off of the dress form. Now we're going to move on to the back bodice, and it is the exact same process, basically, just the back of the bodice. So I've already prepped my fabric and I've already ironed under 1 inch on the grain line. So just like the front, I'm going to pin all the way down center back, making sure that I have enough fabric to drape over the shoulder when we're ready to. Now that I'm done draping center back, we're going to clip into the neck like we did on the front. So now I'm going to clip down just to the neckline to release the lines and the pressure that's happening in the fabric. And just like that, you can see how nice and smooth the neck is. So now I'm going to add just a few pins there. And now I'm going to drape the fabric over to the shoulder and make sure we have a nice smooth shoulder. Now I'm going to pin the shoulder so that way our fabric doesn't move on us while we're draping. Now that we have the shoulder done, we're going to drape the fabric over to the armhole. And again, I like to add a little bit of ease here, just a pinch, about 1/4 of an inch total. Now we're going to drape the fabric over to the side seam and pin. Now that we've pinned the side seam, we need to create our dart. But first we want to clip into the waist just like we did on the front bodice to release any tension that might be happening around the waist. I'm also going to cut off some of this extra fabric on the side. Now it's time to drape the dart the same way we did on the front, draping the fabric over to the dart line. And you can put a few pins here. And then taking the rest of the fabric, folding it, and making it match your princess line. Now the dart on the back is not as big as the front. It's a fairly small dart. And now our back bodice is finished being draped and we can trace it out with pencil. Now I'm going to trace it out just like I did before, following all of the seams and tracing the dart. And just like that, we're done tracing and now we can take out the pins and then transfer both the front and the back bodice to paper. Now to trace out the bodice onto paper, you're going to need your pattern drafting supplies. You're going to need your tracing wheel. You're going to need a 2-inch clear ruler. You're going to need a French curve. You're going to need your pencil. You're going to need your awl, and you're going to need your paper scissors. I'm going to start tracing out the front bodice first. And the first thing we need to do is just draw a nice straight line on our paper so we can line up center front with it. Now that I have a nice straight line, we are going to line up the center front of our bodice with that line. And now we're going to weight down our muslin because we do not want that moving on us. Make sure everything's nice and flat. If you need to iron your muslin, go ahead and iron the muslin. The pencil on the fabric is not going to hurt your iron. Now that we have the drape laid out, you can really see that the lines we trace look just like a pattern. Now we're going to transfer our design to the paper. Normally I would just use the pinwheel, but I'm going to be using some transfer paper under it so that way it's easier for you to see. And after, we're going to connect all those dots so it'll be even easier to see. First, I'm going to transfer out the side seam. And when I lift this up, you can see how we have those dots there. So now we have that side seam. So now what I'm going to do is work my way all the way around the pattern, transferring out these lines. So now I'm going to do the armhole. We're going to move up to the shoulder. Next, the neckline. And now the bottom waist. And next, the dart. Now we can remove our fabric and you're going to see the outline of that front bodice. And there it is. So now what we need to do is true it up. So what that means is that we need to straighten out the line so everything's nice and straight. So I'm going to true up the side seam. So you can see there, some of those dots were outside of that line, and that is why we true that up. So that way we can make this line nice and straight. Now another straight line on here is going to be our shoulder. So I'm going to move on to the shoulder. There's our shoulder. And now we need to do the armhole and the neck, and those are curves. So we want to use our French curve. So now we're going to do the armhole. And first, what I'm going to do is draw out a right angle about 1/4 of an inch. We always want a right angle at the bottom of the armhole and at the top of the armhole. We always want right angles whenever possible. And so now what we're going to do is connect these two together. And there we go. Now we have our armhole. And we're going to do the same thing over here to the neck. Again, you need these right angles here, at least 1/4 of an inch, so that way you don't have any weird dips at center front. And now we have the neck and the armhole, and we're going to move on to the waist. First thing I'm going to do is straighten out this crazy looking dart. So I'm going to find the dart point, and I'm going to match it with the bottom of the dart leg and draw a straight line on one side. Then I'm going to do the same thing for the other side. So now we have our dart legs drawn. You're going to notice that the waist here has a bit of a curve to it for the shape of the dress form, and that's fine. But center front at the waist, again, we want that to be a right angle for at least 1/4 of an inch. And now you can go ahead and use your French curve and blend in that curve that you have there, if you have one. And same thing for the side seam. We want that to be a nice little right angle, and then we can blend into our curves. Okay, and to make sure that the waist is perfectly lined up, we're going to fold the dart. So we're always going to take the dart leg that's closest to center front or center back and fold it towards the side seam. So I gave my front bodice a rough cut here, but leaving enough extra so I can still add seam allowance, just easier to work with and you don't have as much paper. Now what we're going to do is pinch up that pencil line for the dart. Remember the leg closest to center front or center back, always. And now we're going to fold it over. And when we do this, we need to make sure that it's nice and flat and smooth at the tip. So we want these dart legs to line up. So you can see I have a little bit of truing to do down here. This one is a little bit shorter than the other one. So now what we can do is use our French curve and blend these together. There we go. Now we have a nice strong line there. And to get the proper shape for the dart underlay, we're going to take our pinwheel and go right across that bottom pencil line. And when we open it up, we have the dots here for the shape of our dart underlay. So I'm going to draw that in with a pencil. There we go. So there is our new waistline. Now we're almost done with this pattern piece. We just need to add seam allowance. 1/2 inch everywhere, 1/4 inch at the neck. And center front's going to be unfold, so no seam allowance at center front. Going to start with the side seam, and I'm going to line up my pencil line with the 1/2 inch on the ruler. And I'm just going to draw a nice line 1/2 inch away from the other one, always extending past where it needs to be. So down here for the waist, I'm going to go ahead and extend the original waistline that's there. And now I'm going to draw my 1/2 inch. Now you want to follow any curve that you have on your pattern piece for your seam allowance. We want the seam allowance line to just be a replica of the actual sewing line. And so you can see like that, we have the 1/2 inch following the curve out the waist. Now we're gonna move on to the shoulder and the armhole and the neck. So first the shoulder, 1/2 inch. Okay. I'm going to extend these lines here from the sew line into the existing seam allowance. And now we're going to do a 1/2 inch outside of the line for the armhole. And we're just going to work our way all the way around the armhole. So we're adding a 1/4 inch at the neck because the neck isn't a very big curve. It's really small. So it's always a 1/4 inch there. And that's just traditional in the pattern drafting fashion design world. And a 1/2 inch seam everywhere else is traditional as well. Now we're going to move on to the neck. There we go. And now our pattern here is complete with all of its seam allowance. And you're going to notice that in the corners of everything where it overlaps, you end up with these little rectangles or squares. This indicates to someone how much the seam allowance is in what spot. So I know that this would be a 1/2 inch on both seams. And I know here that one is a 1/2 inch and one is a 1/4 inch. It's real easy for you to see. Now we have a few other things to add to the pattern. One is a grain line. So 2 inches away from center front, line up your ruler there, draw a line through your pattern, and then put some arrows on the end of it. And now you want to label your pattern. So front bodice, cut one on fold. It's always a great idea to label the straight line here, C.F for center front. And now we can go ahead and cut out our pattern on our cut line. So let's check out our drape that we transferred to paper and go over those details. So here's our drape in the pink fabric. You can see our lines, they look a little rough, but when we transfer it over to the paper, we clean everything up, we add our seam allowance, and everything looks great. So now that we have the front bodice transferred over to the paper and we added our seam allowance, we need to do the exact same thing for our back bodice. And then we'll sew it up and do a test fit. So I used the exact same process for my back bodice. I transferred it over to the paper, added my dart, folded my dart for the proper underlay, added my seam allowance everywhere, 1/2 inch, except the neck was a 1/4. And just like that, we now have our back bodice pattern. So check it out. We now have a whole bodice pattern that we drape. And 2 things you really want to double check when you're doing the basic bodice is, do the side seams line up? Are they the same length? Does the waist look smooth? Is your armhole looking smooth? And then do the shoulders line up? Are these going to sew together okay? And when you line up the shoulders, is the armhole curve looking nice and smooth? And does your neck hole curve look nice and smooth? And if it doesn't, well, you got to fix it. These ones look nice and smooth, so we're all set to cut it out of fabric and sew it up and give it a test on the dress form. I used my pattern to cut out my fabric, and I cut out a full bodice for this test. To sew it up, the first thing we need to do are sew all of these darts. So we have 2 darts in the front and 2 darts in the back. After we sew up the darts, we need to place our bodice's right sides together and sew up the right side seam, and then both of the shoulders. Make sure you iron open your seams so they're nice and crisp, and then try it on the dress form. And here it is, our finished bodice. It looks gorgeous. It fits so good. We've got our 2 fitted darts on the front, our 2 fitted darts on the back. You'll notice the chest is nice and smooth and nothing is pulling weird anywhere. I love draping because it really lets you see what your final product's gonna look like while you're creating it. Let's turn it around and check out the back. You can see how nice and flat the back looks as well. And what you really want to look for when you're assessing it is make sure you don't see any pull lines. You also want to make sure that your darts are lined up with the princess lines on the bodice, on the back, and on the front. And you can see that these do line up. So this is a good draped basic bodice. So remember, we started the process with this flat fabric, and then we draped it and made it fit this dress form. And then we turned that drape into a paper pattern. And then after that, we sewed it up and we have this beautiful fitted basic bodice. And it wasn't even that hard, was it? So throughout this process, you've learned a lot of different skills, manipulating the fabric around the dress form to get the shape, creating those darts, transferring it over to the paper, truing it up, adding your seam allowances, double checking that everything that's going to be sewn together is going to match up. And then you should have your beautiful basic bodice. Now this process does take a little bit to really feel comfortable with and get a perfect one on the first time. So if your first one doesn't turn out perfect, that is okay. Just keep practicing and trying again, again, and again until you perfect it. And then once you have basic techniques like this down, the sky is the limit with your draping. Then it's time to really get creative. Thanks so much for watching Sewing Anastasia today. If you have any questions on draping this basic bodice, leave it down below in the comments and I'll get back with you as soon as I can. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you know when the new videos come out. And if you're already a subscriber, thank you so much for watching today. These videos are for you guys. And don't forget to let me know what other videos you guys want to see coming up down below in the comments. And if you haven't already subscribed on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, all the social, make sure you do so that way we can stay connected and creative together. And if you join the Sewing Club, you also get access to the Discord, which is private. So make sure you check out that Sewing Club where you get patterns and access to the Discord. There'll be a link down below for that in the description. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.